You're listening to the Slavic Literature Pod, your shelf help guide to all things Slavic. I'm Cameron Lalana, and if you want to learn more about Slavic literature, art, and culture, then you're in the right place. Today, we are finally going to talk about Lydia Chukovskaya's Sofia Petrovna, a novel about the Great Terror, the years of Yezovshchina, that was written during the Terror from 1939 to 1940. Now, admittedly, that is the tail end. Most of the, let's call it the Great Terror proper, we typically consider that to have happened between 1936 to about 1938 in the USSR, but the reality is a little messier than easy definitions allow for. But we will talk more about that more in the context section. And before we really get going, I did want to say a few things. First, I am sorry about how long this episode has taken. As you know, we've been preparing for Sasha Sokolov's Between Dog and Wolf, and I decided to do this episode as a sort of quickie, just to get out because the research for that novel was dragging, and you can basically see where that's landed us. It has also overlapped with my personal life a bit because I've been essentially doing two jobs since a coworker of mine left last year, and another coworker just left last week. So work-wise, I've been getting, how you say, nuked into oblivion. I'm also starting a master's program, which has been its own time suck, but yada, yada, yada. Things have been busy, and I am sorry about how slowly things are moving. This episode was researched and written, and it's looking like it may be recorded too in about 1 hour intervals over a good number of weeks. For this episode, I actually did have a lot of research that I still wanted to do, especially into Chukovskaya's personal life, but I am starting to bump into, let's call it the minimum safe research distance for a couple upcoming podcast interviews. So I'm cutting my losses and recording where we stand now. Today, we are going to talk mostly about the Great Terror and Sofia Petrovna itself. Chukovskaya did write another novel about the purges later, from the late 1940s to the late 1950s, as I understand, and that is called Going Under in English. And at some point in the near-ish future, I am going to finish my research, and we are going to talk about that novel with more context from Chukovskaya's own life. And finally, and this is the last thing I swear, we have some cool stuff coming up that I'm really excited to show you all. My production, as you've probably noticed, has slowed down a lot this year, and I think there's a couple of reasons, but in essence, it's not easy to do this all by myself, from conception to research to, trying to make sure that everything has since it's just you listening to me talk for so long, has enough of a reason for you to come here. So I am working on some solutions. I don't want to talk about all of it just yet because they are early days yet, but I will say that you can look forward to some shows covering Ukrainian modernism, Kazakh poetry, and Sergei Eisenstein with me and some other people. But with all of that out of the way, let's start today by talking about Lydia Chukovskaya. Like I said before, this is going to be a pretty minimal look at her life. If you want to know more now, I do have a couple articles in the show notes that you can take a look at. And like I said, we'll take a deeper dive into her life when we talk about Going Under eventually. Chukovskaya was born in 1907 and was raised mostly in St. Petersburg. She is, I will point out, the daughter of Korney Chukovsky, who was a very well-known poet and writer of children's literature in his own right. Chukovskaya grew up around literature. She would have at least met some of the greatest, let's say biggest literary figures around her time. And she also, with that background, started to work in the publishing industry herself. In 1927, she became an editor at a children's literature publisher known either as Detgiz or Detizdat, depending on the year you're talking about. At some point, she met a physicist by the name of Matvey Petrovich Bronstein, whom she married in 1934. Now, 3 years later, we are now, when she's about 30, give or take, in 1937, which is, if you're familiar with the purges, a notable year for a couple of reasons, just a couple. For Chukovskaya's part, there are two things I do want to point out. First, her husband Matvey was arrested, and he was sentenced to 10 years without right of correspondence, which, as Chukovskaya would later find out, meant he was slated for execution. And Matvey was indeed executed in February of 1938, according to Amber Marie Aragon. Second, that year, Chukovskaya was fired from Detizdat. Now, different sources I've read ascribe the reason for her firing to different reasons. Most commonly, you'll see the claim, and I don't say claim to throw doubt on it necessarily. I'm just calling everything in this particular section a claim because I haven't seen enough to have a definitive opinion on this subject. But she was commonly, you'll see the claim that she was fired as part of a sort of house cleaning. That Detizdat was accused of being bourgeois, some sections were shut down, some staff were fired, and some other staff/authors were arrested and executed. You'll certainly see that on Wikipedia, which additionally claims its headquarters were destroyed, which could be the case. The claim on Wikipedia isn't directly tied to a reference, and I didn't personally see it elsewhere, although I very easily could have missed something. Now, in some articles, you will see that, lightly touched on, in A Path of Healing and Resistance, Lydia Chukovskaya's Sofia Petrovna and Going Under, written by Amber Marie Aragon, who I mentioned just a bit earlier, you get this pretty simple explanation. Quote, she worked as an editor in the children's literary section of the Leningrad State Publishing House until 1930, when her section was shut down and most of her coworkers were arrested. Now, eagle-eared listeners, I guess, may have noticed that Marie Aragon puts the firing in 1930, not 1937. Now, I don't know if that's a typo or an error, but every other source I found puts Chukovskaya's firing and any arrests at that publishing house in 1937. Maybe it was corrected later. I got an earlier paper. I don't quite know. That bit all being said, Without the Free Word, There Are No Free People, Lydia Chukovskaya's writings on terror and censorship, Antonella D'Amelia ties Chukovskaya's firing instead to her husband Matvey's arrest. D'Amelia adds that Chukovskaya was charged with sabotage and included on a list of enemies of the people, and that is something I haven't seen elsewhere. If she was charged, I am unclear on why she wasn't arrested. I've read a bit of part one of Chukovskaya's The Akhmatova Journals, wherein she mentions leaving Leningrad as a result of the arrest, but there she ties it to the NKVD to arrest wives of already arrested husbands. In any case, she doesn't recollect them trying that hard during her flight from St. Petersburg. So her firing in that year, it could be either of those explanations. It could be both, a column A, column B kind of situation. But let's put a pin in that for now, because I can't clarify in this episode, but I do plan to continue investigating. And when I have a chance, I am going to take some time in an academic library to try and find a more concrete answer, because right now it's small potatoes in the broad scheme of things. Both things could have happened, right? They're not mutually exclusive. I've got some more books that I didn't have access to online, but have found in an academic library near me. So we're going to go and wrap that up later if we can. Now, I've already mentioned the Akhmatova Journals. That's a collection of Chukovskaya's journal entries about the famous poet, Anna Akhmatova. So here are a couple interesting things. After Matvey's arrest, Chukovskaya tried to find out why he was arrested, bring him parcels, bring him money, etc., etc. Now, that experience will be somewhat familiar. If you've read Anna Akhmatova's Requiem, I'm sure there are plenty of other works. That's just the one that comes to mind right now. And this experience will be discussed at length in Sofia Petrovna. February. Now, in February of 1938, while bringing money to Matvey, Chukovskaya finds out that he's gone, not in that prison anymore. And you may recognize that as being around the same time that Marie Aragon places Matvey's execution. But of course, the prison gives Chukovskaya the impression that he's been moved, and to go to the prosecutor's office to learn for what and where he is. So she goes, and that's where they tell her to go to Moscow. Now, while in Moscow, a friend calls her and tells Chukovskaya, in coded language, of course, that the police had come looking for her. And like I mentioned earlier, Chukovskaya ties that to the police tendency to pursue a wife after her husband was arrested. So after waiting a little bit, she returns to Leningrad before she heads to Kiev, Vorzel, and Yalta in succession. Now, I'm a little fuzzy on that particular timeline. How long exactly she was gone after that February 1938, how long she spent in each of these cities. And for the life of me, I cannot figure out how I got online access to the Akhmatova Journals to double check my notes from a couple weeks back. But I have tracked down a physical copy. And like I've said, I will continue, like I have said, and we'll continue to say today. We will come back to that later when we talk about Going Under. But essentially, that flight ends when her father, Cornet, this is not the best episode for pronunciations for me, it ends when her father contacts her to say that things have settled down, so she goes back to Leningrad. Now, with all of that going on, Chukovskaya sits down to write Sofia Petrovna in a school exercise book between 1939 and 1940. According to Marie Aragon, Chukovskaya unofficially learned about Matvei's execution in December of 1939, and if that is the case, she would have written some portion of this book already knowing her husband's fate. After it was completed, Chukovskaya shared this book to be with just a small group of people, including Anna Akhmatova, and she writes this about it in the Akhmatova journals. Quote, "At about the same time I read Sofia Petrovna to Anna Andreevna, I also read it to some of my friends. I invited 8 people to my place, but the 9th one turned up uninvited, almost against my will. No, he was not a traitor, and he did not run to the big house to inform on me, but he did talk too much. He told someone else the interesting piece of news, and that someone told someone else, and by the end of 1940, this news in a distorted form became known over there through grapevine. There, they'd found out I was hiding some document about 37. That is how the interrogator who questioned my close and not so close ones referred to Sofia Petrovna." End quote. Now, the police don't appear to have known exactly what this document about 37 was, 37 being another name for the terror, much like Yezovshina. But anyway, they didn't appear to know exactly what it was, just that it existed. So all the same, this led to Chukovskaya leaving Leningrad for the second time on May 5th, 1941. For this following section, I am going to rely pretty heavily on a single source, the chapter Lydia Chukovskaya's Sofia Petrovna and Going Under, fictionalizing Stalin's purges, which is from Yasha Klotz's book Tamizdat, Contraband Russian Literature in the Cold War Era. I am naming that now so I don't have to keep saying it over and over again through this section. So if you want a more in-depth look, you can find a link to that chapter in the show notes. When Chukovskaya left Leningrad for the second time, she did not bring the manuscript for Sofia Petrovna with her. Instead, she left it with a former classmate named Isidor Glikin. Now, Glikin was considered unfit for military service, so he remained in Leningrad throughout World War II, or at least for the part of the war that he survived. He would die of starvation in January 1942, but before his death, he did pass the manuscript to his sister, who kept it safe until Chukovskaya returned in June 1944. Klotz adds this quotation from Chukovskaya's notes. Quote, "With a strange feeling of alienation, I was leafing through these pages about another pre-war death, 1937 to 1940. In 1944, it seemed to me that that war was over. That war in this context means the Years of Terror. I do think there is an interesting note to make about perception, one that we will dig into later in this episode, that not everyone agrees on when the Great Terror happened. I'm resisting using the term Yezovshina too often in this episode because, well, Stalin removed Yezhov from his position and replaced him with Lavrenti Beria in 1938. So it doesn't technically make sense when you're talking about someone who considers the terror to have lasted beyond that point, but, typically historians look back and peg the terror to 1936, 37, 38, but not everyone who lived it saw it the same way. The NKVD certainly arrested people before and after those years, which makes this kind of messy of what exactly is, the terror itself, and perceptions of people who were there also vary. Chukovskaya in her notes considers the terror to have started in 1937, possibly because that's when police began arresting people she knew or was aware of. But again, we will talk more about that later. And by the way, I've been assuming that you know who Nikolai Yezhov is, but just in case you don't, Yezhov was a Communist Party functionary whose star rose pretty rapidly throughout the mid-1930s. He was a part of the purges around 1933, and those were purges in the traditional sense, a purging from the rolls of Communist Party members who were found wanting in one way or another. Now, this was not a campaign of arrest and execution. Yezhov was also part of the politically minded investigation into the aftermath of the assassination of Politburo member Sergei Kirov. In September 1936, Stalin removes the then head of the NKVD, Genrikh Yagoda, and replaces him with Yezhov. Yezhov would then oversee a massive ramp-up of the NKVD's now bloody purges, which we call the Great Terror, or the Purges, or the Years of Yezovshina. And for his part, Stalin would then go on to remove Yezhov as well in 1938. Yezhov was then secretly arrested in 1939 and executed in 1940. This was not general knowledge at the time. Even after Chukovskaya got her manuscript back, she did keep it hidden until long after Stalin's death. Specifically, Nikita Khrushchev's so-called secret speech in 1956, wherein he criticized Stalin as having created a cult of personality and laid the carnage of the Great Terror at his feet. After that, for a time, we have what we call the Khrushchev thaw, when some freedom of information was allowed. Though, as Chukovskaya found out, that did not necessarily mean that everything would come out. Chukovskaya submitted Sofia Petrovna to the journal Novy Mir, meaning New World, in late 1961, where the chief editor at the time was Alexander Tvardovsky. Now, if you listen to our series on Life and Fate, you will recognize the name Tvardovsky. It is one and the same man. As Klasha, combining names here, as Klotz notes, Chukovskaya submitted her manuscript at around the same time that Solzhenitsyn submitted One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. That'll be important, because Tvardovsky rejected her piece in January 1962, giving feedback that it did not reflect the background of all people's life, that it was boring, and that it reduced people to literary designations. In the rejection, Tvardovsky concludes with, quote, "The author is not a beginner in need of literary advice, but an advanced writer and editor who, as I see it, took up a project that is none of her business." Now, it is important to note that Tvardovsky wasn't rejecting her piece because it was about the purges exactly. He had accepted One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which Novy Mir did publish that same year. And I don't have enough to give you a definitive answer on the differing reaction, but I can read you Klotz's argument for this. Quote, "Although both works belonged to the same genre, they stood too far apart from each other ideologically and aesthetically, motivating Tvardovsky's preference for Solzhenitsyn's positive hero over Chukovskaya's not-so-heroic mad mother. In fact, the more similar the two works had seemed on the surface, the deeper were the irreconcilable differences between them. Unlike Solzhenitsyn, Chukovskaya failed to address the plight of the people during collectivization, but focused instead on the persecution of the intelligentsia during the Great Terror, which, for Tvardovsky, was secondary, not only historically, but also ethnically. Neither Requiem nor Sofia Petrovna was, strictly speaking, a first-hand account of the camps. Rather, as Leona Toker defined the term, they were narratives by non-witnesses, in which the camps and prison represent the Orwellian Room 101, where imagination fears to tread. In contrast to the detailed interiors of Ivan Denisovich's camp, the settings of Sofia Petrovna and Requiem were limited to the liminal spaces familiar to the authors, that is, the lines of women outside prison. Now, Chukovskaya then submitted the novel to 3 other journals and the publishing house Soviet Writer. One of the journals sent back an edited version, which Klotz argues was more stylistic than ideological, but all the same, Chukovskaya refused to allow any edits. Now, she did seek out that journal's editor in Moscow, who opined that Sofia Petrovna, the character, not the novel, should be more enthusiastic about Soviet peoples, at which point her son's downfall would, quote, "occupy the right place in our life, the fatal haphazardness, and error." In other words, the purges were, from his view, not so much a systematic policy or a cautionary tale on systematic failures, but rather a period of carelessness on the government's part. So obviously she later got a rejection from that journal, refusing any changes to her book. And in this process, while she was still trying to get these other journals to publish, she would run into another roadblock. Nikita Khrushchev, the same man who had opened the door in the first place, who opined that Soviet writers had to move beyond just describing the horrors of Stalinism and to raise the faith of readers in the current values and future of the Soviet system. In other words, you can write about it, but you've got to focus on us being different now. Shortly after, the 2 other journals also rejected that novel. Now, Chukovskaya did have some success with the publishing house Soviet Writer. By 1963, she had signed a contract with them and gotten an advance payment for the novel. They had even produced a cover design and illustrations for Sofia Petrovna, but the mood, as you can probably guess, had shifted. It was being course-corrected from the Soviet government on this, whole opening of speech thing. In a March meeting between Soviet leadership and intelligentsia, Khrushchev was not pleased and Chukovskaya guessed correctly that her book was not going to be published. And just a few days later, a higher up at Soviet writer told her that the novel was being reconsidered. The publishing house passed the novel onto a critic who opined to Chukovskaya that the book did not reinforce the people's faith in the Soviet Union and that it would not be published, at least not for maybe 15 years or so. That being said, Chukovskaya would sue Soviet writer for not publishing the book, and she did win the remainder of the money promised to her. Now, Sofia Petrovna, despite not being published in the Soviet Union at that time, was leaked abroad, and the exact reason and method is not known, so I won't go over it here, but it was published in Paris in 1966 under the title The Deserted House. I'm not clear what the reason for the change was, but Klotz suggests it's an allusion to Anna Akhmatova's Requiem that was meant for readers to make a connection and thereby boost sales. But there were also plenty of edits, likely ones that Chukovskaya would not have approved of, given her reaction to the journal in the USSR that sent back an edited version of the novel. And there is more to the story here, including a more accurate version of Sofia Petrovna that was published only slightly later, but I don't want to get bogged down in its life abroad. In the Soviet Union itself, Sofia Petrovna wasn't published until 1988, just a few years before the end of the Soviet Union, and just 8 years before Chukovskaya's own death in 1996. Oh, that is the short summary. Only I could make a short story and still make it 22 minutes long somehow. Obviously, there is more that I could not fit in here. And we will, like I've said, talk about that at a later date. And you can read the linked papers if you are interested. But for now, let's talk more about the Great Terror. I want to start this part of the discussion by pulling the curtains back a little bit. History, as a profession, as an academic study. And I think most people outside of academia, not everybody certainly, but most people that I have met in my life, they tend to look at the study of history as kind of a bullet point list. This thing happened on this date, which led to this thing on this other date, and then some surprising thing happened on this date, which led to such and such outcome. But the study of history is, as you probably understand, more complex than that. It is also a process of interpretation. Historians take their primary evidence and their scholarly sources. They use their critical thought to decide which elements are relevant or are not relevant or are only important to a certain degree. They do a lot more than that, obviously, but they do all of this to construct a narrative about a time and a place or a person which they think most faithfully represents the things that happened, at least to the best of their ability given the evidence they have. And, of course, not everybody agrees on what things are or are not relevant. But if enough people agree on a general set of things that are important, that thinking might become what we'd call a school or a model of thought. Let's just call it a school to keep it simple. Now, these schools are always moving targets because people are always reacting to them, either arguing against them, or just an element of it, or writing to buttress the school of thought, or even to iterate on it, right? I mean, this is basically true in every discipline, some form of that. Like if you've ever studied international politics, that's probably the most obscure example I could have chosen for this, but that's what I studied. So, in international politics, you've got two big schools of thought, liberalism and realism. But Hans J. Morgenthau developed the ideas that served as the basis of realism in the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s. And today, realists don't believe that exact theory that he formulated, as much as they believe and argue with theories that are downstream from realism, most notably structuralist realism. It's the same basic idea here. It's the same basic idea in, psychology or whatever. That would have been a way better example to explain this, but hey, this is what I studied. But the reason why I am saying all of this is because for a long time during the Cold War, the dominant mode of thought for American historians with respect to the Soviet Union was the totalitarian school, which emphasized the importance of Soviet leadership, power emanating outward. Its adherents examined life in the USSR as a downstream reaction to central power, Stalin, of course, at the center. Now, towards the 70s and 80s, more historians started to challenge that approach and started examining the USSR a bit more holistically, looking at lower-level institutions or people, right? More of a bottom-up approach. And both of those approaches still have purchase in popular history today, especially totalitarianism, I would say, if you have a kind of a baseline understanding or a popular historian understanding of the Soviet Union. But academically speaking, the world has moved on, especially from the totalitarian school. And reactions to revisionism led to post-revisionist thought, and so on and so on. And I don't really know what schools dominate today. This is not my field of expertise. I don't know how much purchase, the past has on current historians. So you would have to talk to an actual academic of Soviet history to understand the current context of what schools are, what the popular modes of thought are. I won't get into that. I don't know it. But the reason why I mention all of this is because the sources I'm using in this section are pretty heavily revisionist or are downstream of revisionist thought. That does color my view of the period, and of course it colors my explanation here of the terror. So that's something I want to just put up front. That's a bias I'm going into this with. And additionally, while none of the sources that I'm using in this section, as far as I can tell, are considered invalid today, there have been, they are not all of them are the most recent, and there have been a great deal of articles that came out after some of the ones I've read, which I am mentioning because I don't want to give you the impression that you are walking away with the cutting edge of research into the Stalinist terror. And I do wish I could give you that, but I don't have enough time to read everything. And my goal here is to give you enough context to get a general feeling for the era that Chukovskaya is responding to in Sofia Petrovna. So, don't go around acting like an expert after this. If anything, everything I have read in the past month has made me more uncomfortable about writing this section, not because of the subject matter, although it's not going to win you any popularity points at cocktail parties, but I do appreciate way more now how acutely limited my understanding of the Great Terror is. So, if you're interested in what I'm talking about, treat it as a jumping off point. There are plenty of sources for you in the description. But for now, let's talk about the 1930s. And let me say at the front, I will be citing this a lot. This following section draws very heavily on Stalin Volume 2, Waiting for Hitler, 1928 to 1941, by Stephen Kotkin. I think in popular history that some people think about the Great Terror and kind of imagine, maybe have you ever seen The Death of Stalin, right? That great comedy movie, first of all. If you haven't, you definitely should. And if you have, watch it again. Very worthwhile. But in the movie, the NKVD, basically every night, are pulling buses up to apartment buildings, sending armed men inside to pull out a bunch of residents. And talking to people in my own life, I've gotten the impression that that is how a fair number of non-specialists view the Great Terror. Like, that was happening everywhere, all the time. And don't get me wrong, there were a lot of arrests in the Great Terror. I'm not trying to talk around that, but I do want to say that this view does obviate the nuance of what actually happened here, which is what we're going to be talking about today to kind of add that level of unevenness to reality, that not everyone experienced the same thing. One last thing. Oh, God, I feel like Columbo. This episode's basically the Night of the Living prefaces. But in the Soviet Union, you didn't have to join the Communist Party. I mean, if you wanted to advance your career, then probably yes. But it wasn't the case that you were legally compelled to, and most Soviet citizens were not. It wasn't necessarily easy to join the party either, although that does somewhat depend on the era, and you probably already know that. But I have met some number of people over the years who were under the belief that it was compulsory, so I wanted to address it. And I have to admit that that group does include me. My mother was very much a product of the Cold War, and I've always liked history, although I will say the quality of my sources has massively improved with time. Now, we could start the story in a lot of places, and I am tempted to start it with the campaign of dekulakization from 1929 to 1930, wherein the OGPU, which is the NKVD's predecessor, arrested, executed, and exiled. Well, executed or exiled. You can't get executed and exiled. That's a pretty big, that'd be a pretty big fuck you. Under many people under suspicions of them being a kulak, which primarily affected rural people. And that's not something that necessarily crossed the minds of or even awareness of people who would later be the subject of the Great Terror. I think it would be a nice introduction into the importance of categories of people for this story. The category of kulak, or rural person, who was arrested, not to the great notice of the Soviet world at large, but that is a little remote from my next data point in this story, so I won't start there. I am going to bring it up, as I already have, just to put a bug in your ear about that idea of categories of people. But instead, let's start in 1934. January 26th of that year rang in the USSR's 17th Party Congress, which brought together thousands of delegates. And something I want to point out here is that at this point, just 10% of the Communist Party's membership in 1934 had joined during the Civil War. But the majority of delegates at this party Congress came from that 10%. In other words, the leadership of the USSR at this point were mostly people who had joined and served under Vladimir Lenin, not Stalin. There was already at this point a push to purge ineffective leadership from the party. As Kotkin notes, Stalin gave a 5-hour keynote which touched on the need to push out, quote, empty words leaders, end quote, regardless of their prior service. Now, whether those so-called empty words leaders were actually ineffective or paralyzed/undercut by decisions from higher up, it's probably a mix of both. If you've ever worked at an organization with more than like 30 people, you've probably seen both types here. And that speech wasn't just words. Stalin gave it amid a purge of the party already happening. Now, this was a purge in the sense that much more often happens in Soviet history, a small p purge in organizational sense. Expulsions from the party, not so much arrests, which came after party membership had ballooned in the late 20s and early 30s. By the time the purge started in 1933, the party included 2.2 million members and 1.35 million candidates, which totals about 3.55 million people. Now, in 1934, the year before this Congress we've been talking about, the party announced that purge to seek out members who were found wanting, not achieving party goals, violators of discipline, etc., etc. And in those 2 years, 33 and 34, around 800,000 members were either expelled or left rather than face the expulsion process. Now, it was not the first party purge, and it would not be the last. That was organizational, bureaucratic, not bloody. I will point out that this purge primarily affected the rank and file, especially those who were newer to the party, which it wasn't necessarily, as you might assume, a house cleaning of the old guard, which is kind of what the Great Terror will become. And that is not to say that 1934 was a year free of the secret police. There were certainly arrests, with suspicion primarily falling on people from other countries and minority ethnic groups as potential spies for other countries. But to give you an impression of how different the environment was, that year, two very high-ups in the Soviet government, Valerian Kuibyshev and Andrei Zhdanov, received evidence that secret police were using torture to extract confessions, and the suggestion was made, that they passed on, that they cleanse the ranks of such personnel. And it's not clear if this ever comes to anything, but as Kotkin writes, quote, Stalin approved a suggestion to send plenipotentiaries to Azerbaijan for a thorough investigation of efforts to advance careers through sheer quantity of confessions extracted. End quote. You might see that as an empty gesture, something just to mollify or placate someone of, oh yeah, I'll look into it. But it does represent a different mindset of what Stalin might thought he needed to, if this was not a genuine, oh, okay, let's look into that. The idea that you would need to look into that is a different mindset than what will come, let's say. Now, things start to change on December 1st, 1934. And that's when a disaffected ex-party member, Leonid Nikolaev, shoots and kills the old Bolshevik, Politburo member, and head of the Leningrad Communist Party, Sergei Kirov. If you've ever studied Slavic history at all, you have heard Kirov's name quite a bit. Now, this assassination happens right outside his office at the Smolny Institute in Leningrad, which, fun fact, when I was studying in Petersburg, St. Petersburg State University put my classes in Smolny Cathedral, which is right next door. Also, the park in front is called, what was it? The Victory of the Proletariat, something of the Proletariat, Will of the Proletariat Park. Great name for a park. I don't make them like that anymore for various reasons. But anyway, I am not going to get into the particulars of Kirov's assassination here. I will point out, if you are not already steeped in this because you had to take a class on it at some point in your life, that many people, including historians, do believe that Stalin ordered Kirov's assassination. And that's a very persistent belief. There were certainly people at the time who also believed it. I was actually taught that in college too. But there are others, including Kotkin, who argue otherwise. I am not going to litigate it here, but I will say that through this research process, the latter camp has convinced me that the Stalin ordered it theory is pretty unlikely, probably. You can read Kotkin's take on it at around page 230, maybe a little after Stalin Volume 2. I am also going to link another article, which is a bit older, titled Did Stalin Kill Kirov and Does It Matter? By Matt Lenoe, Lenoe. Could go a couple different ways in that one, which covers some of the major claims on either side, although I think Lenoe ultimately comes down on the same side as Kotkin, or at the very least believes that that side is making a stronger case than the case being made that Stalin did order Kirov's death. But regardless of the attack's origin, Stalin certainly used Kirov's death as a political weapon. He insisted that investigators not treat it as a lone wolf attack, but rather as one with some kind of organization behind it. Specifically, one Lev Trotsky. Although this supposed Trotskyite network would quickly evolve to include other in-country opposition figures, notably Lev Kamenev and Grigory Zinoviev. Soon, these two would be part of the center of the Zinoviev... Oh boy. I have this written, I wrote this down so many times, we're going to see if I can make it through in one take. Zinovievite, Kamenite, Trotskyite terror group. They were not aware of that before, I presume. For future reference, I'm just going to call it the ZKT group to avoid butchering it every single time. I am not going to talk about Stalin's psychology with this decision. I am not equipped to make arguments to you about why he did it. It could have been an intentional first step to cleanse the rank of opposition forces. Maybe that's giving him too much credit. Maybe it was paranoia. Maybe he genuinely believed the NKVD needed to look harder. There are even people who've done a lot more research on this who go a lot of different ways in this one. Kotkin opines plenty. Your mileage may vary in Kotkin, although I'm relying on him. Talking about it through, I've met many people who are very, how you say, lukewarm on Kotkin. Matt, for example, I was chatting with him about it. He opined to me that he thinks Kotkin has a tendency to overinterpret at times. So, keep that in mind if you do go and read Kotkin's account. There are plenty of others as well. But regardless of all of that, me personally, to be honest, I do think there's a fair amount of futility in playing armchair psychology, 50, 60, 70, 80 years in the future. I am not that interested in why as so much as I am in what. So that's kind of what I'm focusing on here today. But as those investigations progressed, suspicions began to broaden. Things began to, boulders began to roll, and it's kind of hard to get them to stop rolling. For example, at this point, someone denounced as a member of the cleaning staff at the Kremlin, and several NKVD members get involved. This evolves into them believing that some members of the cleaning staff are part of a counter-revolutionary group, which leads them to arrest and interrogate staff, which tends to lead to new names and new arrests. They also learned that some of the library staff at the Kremlin who were daughters of former nobles, and from there it keeps expanding. And eventually the NKVD arrests 112 people in what is known as the Kremlin Affair, or more commonly I've seen it as the Kremlin Plot. This is our first look at how the Great Terror would start to rope in higher-ups, because those arrested had mostly been hired by Avel Yanukidze, who was a member of the Central Committee. And when the NKV starts arresting your staff, it doesn't take a great leap of logic for them to start asking, well, how could you have possibly employed so many counter-revolutionaries without knowing? And you can see how this game starts to work. Suspicion gets thrown on one person, they get taken into interrogation. To stop the pain, they give another name, that leads to someone else, and a whole network suddenly appears. And then you got to look at leadership and say, how did you not know this was here? It becomes kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And this is where Yezhov, who we talked about earlier, who is at this point a member of the Central Committee, gets involved in our story. He writes a manuscript that argues Zinovievites, right deviationists, and Trotskyites were planning a coup, and we know that Stalin reads that report. In June 1935, at a Central Committee plenum meeting, Yezhov also connects the Kremlin affair with Kirov's murder. This is not just a counter-revolutionary group of some number of counter-revolutionaries plus old bourgeois elements. This is part of Kirov's murder. This is part of that ZKT group who is planning actual terror attacks. Up to that point, Nikolaevite, oh my God, I'm doing it for everyone. Nikolaev, in this initial investigation, it wasn't necessarily concluded that the so-called ZKT group had funded and made this attack happen, so much as they created the quote-unquote moral environment that led to it. But anyway, so at this plenum meeting, Yezhov argues that the ZKT group is behind it and is behind other terror attacks, at which point the Central Committee expels Yonikidze but does not arrest him. And this is something that will kind of change. Again, we'll talk about it more as it goes. We're not necessarily going to come back to Yonikidze because there's so many moving parts here, but even outside of the Kremlin affair in the Kirov investigation, the NKVD was also looking for Trotskyites, both real and imagined. Mostly imagined, but there were some genuine Trotsky groups. As Kotkin points out, despite the fact that they were real and smuggling literature in the Soviet Union, they were never in any position to take any action against the Soviet state. They met, they kept literature, and it did not mean much more than the fact that the NKVD would occasionally actually bust a real Trotskyite. Now, these arrests were not huge. They numbered in the hundreds. And so going into 1936, Genrikh Yagoda, who is, again, at this point still in control of the NKVD, would recommend execution for these Trotskyites, but the Politburo stipulated that those arrested be sent to concentration camps with only those found guilty of terrorism being executed. Even though there are elements of what is to come, we are not at the terror as people recognize it, even when we were heading into 1936. And amid all of this, most Soviet people were not, broadly speaking, afraid of what was to come, at least not afraid of what was coming from their own government. To quote Kotkin at some length here, in the USSR, an entire generation was coming of age in what seemed like the most heroic epoch in history, acquiring skills, education, apartments, building and living socialism. New or wholly reconstructed factories abounded, their production celebrated daily. The famine had been left behind and rationing was abolished. In the economy, the years 1934 to 1936 turned out to be relatively good, as the country consolidated its investments. Waste was colossal, of course, but most of the rest of the world was still mired in the effects of the Great Depression. The regime had also eased up on the state of emergency, the extrajudicial and judicial executions, and yet the land of Soviets remained deeply insecure. At this point, Kotkin goes on to explain Pavlov's bell. I presume you probably don't need that, but he finally comes back to write, the Soviet populace too had been conditioned. The bell sounded by the regime was capitalist encirclement, and people's reflexive response was fear of foreign invasion and war. Let's continue on to 1936. Now, just to get a sense of perspective, from 1934 to 1936, according to Kotkin, the NKVD arrests around 530,000 people. Over half of those arrests were for counter-revolutionary crimes, and compared to what was become, the executions were relatively few, under 4,500 arrests. Now, that would ramp up rapidly in 1937, which is why people call it, refer to the years of Yezhovshchina as 37, not 36. But despite that, most sources still place the Great Terror start in 1936. And historically speaking, there's a fair reason to triangulate it to that year. In 1936, you do have the first of 3 Moscow show trials, in which several notable opposition members were accused of being part of the ZKT terrorist center, who had planned to conspire to kill Kirov, and planned to kill other members of the Soviet government as well. This group, of course, included Zinoviev and Kamenev themselves. All of the accused in this trial were found guilty and sentenced to death. Also in 1936, as we pointed out earlier, Nikolai Yezhov replaces Yagoda at the head of the NKVD, but we're getting ahead of ourselves with that one. I want to spend a bit more time on the trial. At this point, keep in mind, Yagoda is still the head of the NKVD, and he's working with Yezhov. at the point of the trial in 1936, we are over a year out from Kirov's murder. Not quite 2 years. Keep in mind it was in December of 1934. But despite closing the case in 1935, the NKVD closing in 1935, Stalin felt that there was more they weren't seeing. And he also wanted a high-profile broadcasted trial of the people at the center of the ZKT group. So Yezhov and Yagoda reopened the case. And Yagoda begins criticizing regional NKVD bosses for various failures that basically boiled down to not arresting enough Trotskyites. And you may start to see some pressures that are going to later lead to ballooning arrest numbers. But they begin to reinterrogate Zinoviev and Kamenev, who under duress testify about a larger conspiracy going on. And I think amidst all of this, I also want to note that the Politburo was not entirely on board with this, which is something that is going to change, because obviously their opposition is not successful, especially as you get into the depths of the terror itself. They're going to become enthusiastic participants, at the very least, to protect their own skin and possibly the skin of the people directly beneath them, although not always successful in that front. Around that time as well, Stalin also sends out a circular drafted by Yezhov to party organizations around the USSR that declares the Trotskyites are almost defeated and therefore turning to their last means of struggle: terror attacks. This is something that's going to be very relevant in Chukovskaya's novel. This claim that their Trotskyites are carrying out bombings or other attacks. And it looks for people, it asks people to look for those hidden enemies. And if you could find those hidden enemies, there might be a reward in it for you. Maybe your boss happens to be an enemy. Again, we'll come back to that in Chukovskaya. This revival of the case leads to what we now call the Moscow show trial, which, like I said, was the first of three, the last one happening in 1938. So, on August 16th, 1936, the state puts 16 defendants on trial. Now, that group also includes 5 German communists who had fled to the USSR along with the oppositionists. All in all, there were 150 audience members, all invited, of course. That included foreign journalists, diplomats, and plainclothes NKVD officers. The defendants got onto the stand and confessed their guilt, often implicating others who were not on trial. This would lead to later investigations as well. I read somewhere, and for the life of me, I swear to God, I wrote this down. I don't know if I did some of my notes in a physical notebook, which I have forgotten where I put somewhere. Wouldn't it be funny if I was looking at it right now? Oh my God, I think I left it on my desk and I completely forgot it was right here. Oh, I was looking so long for these. Wow. I'm going to have to stop this recording and read this before I continue on. I definitely missed a bunch of stuff in the script I wrote. There are a lot of notes in here that I could not reference. Wow. Oh. All right. Well, I'm going to reflect on that later. Somewhere in this notebook, there's a source in here for this. I swear, I just don't remember which article it was that this came from. Confessions are incredibly over the top to the point where they are. This author argues they were meant to be taken as, can you believe this? I'm confessing so much that you could not possibly believe this. However, this was undercut by most of the people in attendance, either being NKVD officers or not native Russian speakers, see foreign journalists / diplomats who were not necessarily well placed to understand the irony in their statements. And later on, the transcripts were edited before they were released, taking out any ironies that native speakers might have noticed. I can't necessarily speak to the truth of that. I would point out more if I could find out where in my notes I put that, but that's a possibility. I might put that in the show notes if I could figure out where I took that from. But anyway, they confess their guilt. They are all found guilty, and then they are shot. Not in front of the crowd, later in a cellar. But this is how this whole thing starts to spread. And one person I will note, one of the people implicated in this trial was Mikhail Tomsky, who was another member of the Central Committee, who, upon finding out that he was also going to be investigated, shot himself, but not before he left a little revenge. His wife spreads a rumor that he was an opposition member, and the catalyst for his opposition, Genrikh Yagoda himself. Afterwards, Yezhov and others push Stalin to remove Yagoda, which Stalin eventually does, claiming that Yagoda is not up to the task ahead. He then picks Yezhov to replace him, a decision that, as Kotkin notes, was not a given. This was not Kotkin or Yezhov making a sure bet that he was getting replaced. If he intended this, which I kind of assume he did. It was a gamble. Yagoda would, of course, later be arrested, but neither here nor there. Here's what Kotkin writes about Yezhov's elevation, taking this line from, I think, the memoirs of a Chekist at the era. Quote, the majority of old Chekists were convinced that with the coming to the NKVD of Yezhov, we would at last return to the traditions of Dzerzhinsky, overcome the unhealthy atmosphere and the careerist, degenerating, and fabricating tendencies introduced in the organs during the last years of Yagoda. We thought the now firm and reliable hand of the Central Committee would reign in the organs. Kotkin remarks that this, and I quote, speaks to their illusions. After Yezhov's ascension, the NKVD begins to expand their work, and it's worth keeping in mind here that the NKVD, like any country-spanning organization, had its national leadership and regional offices run by local bosses, and not every regional office worked the same way. So determinations of hidden enemies were often made locally, and typically looked at people that they perceived as being capable of harming the party, which was quite often the Communist Party itself, the military, the intelligentsia, specialized trades, not so much your average kolkhoz worker. And I want to say, this was not a free-for-all grab bag from all of these groups. It seems to be that the case that it came in waves. We'll talk more about that later. But local party bosses in this environment would try to balance protecting their people while demonstrating zeal in denunciations, because if you weren't finding anyone, then obviously you weren't looking. But if you were trying to expose others, right, and you seem to be protecting some people, they might start taking a closer look at your people, or quite often you yourself. When Stalin sent Central Committee members to investigate various regions, they would sometimes arrest the whole party leadership there, and sometimes their replacements were also arrested, in some cases multiple times over, which obviously had downstream effects on the local production, causing further problems, because the problem was they weren't completing their plan in the first place. And as you might know, if you know anything about this era, being in the NKVD also did not prevent you from being suspected. Yezhov looked especially closely at the NKVD's leadership under Yagoda, with 17 of the 18 commissars of state security who had served under Yagoda being shot. The 18th didn't escape either. He was poisoned. The main directorate of state security, which is the part of the NKVD that is directly responsible for the terror, also arrested around 2,300 of its own, around 270 from the central office, and a little over 2,000 from regional offices. And members of the NKVD were pretty aware of how tenuous their position could be. While a lot of arrests meant promotions, stolen goods, etc., it also brought you closer positions of leadership. It also brought you closer to places where if someone else was arrested, you might be implicated. And, if you were involved in the ousting of many of the people from under Yagoda, you probably would be aware how tenuous your position might be if Yezhov were to go, which of course he would in 1938. But the NKVD also turns their eye on the officer corps of the military, and starting in 1937, of 144,000 officers, this paragraph is going to have a lot of numbers, I'm sorry about that in advance, the police arrested some 33,000. This especially targeted the highest ranks, quote, among the highest rungs of 186 commanders of divisions, the carnage took 154. That leaves just 31 left, as well as 8 of its 9 admirals. I don't know if they are admirable. 13 of the Army's 15th full generals, and 3 of its 5 marshals. Now, Kotkin does not have an explanation for why the military leadership was so thoroughly targeted. You can probably find someone else who will suggest it for you. Again, I'm not so interested in the why. The what is, it happened. I would like to emphasize at this point that this is like a good example of how the terror was both widespread and localized. There were, around this point, around 1.4 million members of the Soviet armed forces, but below the officer class, you largely don't see arrests. So you have a case here where it's the military, but the arrests are not just from the military up and down. They are largely from the upper echelons here, especially the highest rungs being hit the hardest. I also want to note that they're outside of the NKVD, the military, right, the party leadership itself. There was also an ethnic element which acted a little bit differently. Some minority groups like Latvians were broadly suspected of crimes like spying, and they were persecuted. And that happened irrespective of their position in society, which is different from how the terror was generally carried out. So some ethnic groups, the idea of the terror that sometimes people have as everyone everywhere all at once, a little bit true for some minority groups. So far, I have been emphasizing, as I've noted, that the Great Terror disproportionately affected the elites. Kotkin cites this joke from the era, which gets at that. Quote, when uniformed men arrived at a door and said NKVD, the people inside answered, saying, you've got the wrong apartment. The communists live upstairs. But of course, the terror would become more generalized to include, as I've said, intelligentsia, specialized workers, etc., etc. But I do want to add that opposite the traditional portrayal of the terror as something that was so general, the scholarship we have today does show a more complex portrait of the time. And here are a couple thoughts and notes I took away from R.W. Thurston's article, Fear and Belief and the USSR's Great Terror, Response to Arrest, 1935 to 1939. In it, Thurston writes, quote, despite the claims that some writers have made of pervasive fear dating from 1935, the recollection of various survivors do not indicate such a feeling or the sense that mass arrests were taking place at any point earlier than 1937. I should note, I noted much earlier in this episode that Chukovskaya believed the terror started in 1937, which, again, even as this is all happening, they don't have perfect information in the way that we don't have perfect information. We have a better point of view looking back into the past, reading people who are digging into archives, have access to meeting notes and knowledge that they certainly didn't have. So you can see how perceptions would differ of when the terror even happened. And so broadly speaking, I want you to consider that information transmission in a somewhat closed society in the 1930s is a little bit different than it is today. They did, well, of course, not everyone in the world, but if you're listening to this podcast right now, you know, you have access to more readily information than most people did at this time. Unless you had a radio or something, I guess. They did broadcast 3 show trials in Moscow, ranging from 36 to 38, and papers would write about arrests, but most people did not appear to have a sense of scale of the arrests. Now, later on, maybe so, especially as more people they know start getting arrested, but really, a lot of this is coming by word of mouth, which again goes back to categories that I mentioned at the start of the section. People appear to consider this era in terms of categories, you know, when people in their circles or in the circles of their circles, you know, radiating outward, word starts getting through that, oh, so-and-so in such group, this many people from this industry, et cetera, starts trickling down. Information is not moving the same way as it would today. And I think that's something you have to appreciate looking back in the past. But by the time of the first show trial and investigations in 1936, people are mostly seeing higher-ups in the Communist Party and foreigners being arrested, which to them was another realm. Thurston cites plenty of personal accounts from people outside those targeted groups, including private accounts that do not indicate anything other than life as normal until the spring of 1937, at which point he writes, quote, survivors do not agree on a starting date in 1937 for mass arrests, but thereafter they often remember a keen sense of categories involved. This memory suggests that those outside of such groups did not fear arrests. Even some of those arrested recall thinking they were innocent, but that everyone else in there with them belonged there. Thurston notes other sources which indicate people in targeted industries might avoid promotions to leadership positions, indicating a belief that even within targeted groups, it was leadership who was really taking the brunt, or the case of another engineer who quit his profession and become a doorman, reflecting a belief that, right, the problem is the profession. If you get out, you'll be safe. And bringing that all together, he writes, quote, the dangers of arrest was frequently perceived as being limited to certain groups. People outside such categories did not sense that they too might be arrested. Within the high-risk cohorts, some people took steps to avoid arrest. And as for how people actually thought about the terror, actually understood it once it became general enough for people to kind of know about it, they appear to have taken it different ways. Thurston points to contemporary and later writings that indicate some people who believed that this campaign was necessary and right and just for the society. The NKVD did have great success recruiting willing informants among groups who were not typically being targeted. So there were some people who did believe in it. Some people believed in it up to a certain breaking point, often when maybe they themselves or a family member arrested. But even then, there are plenty of accounts of people who were arrested or had a family member arrested who generally thought things were just, but this specific case was the one aberration. Now, Some people have believed a bit of both as well, that not every arrest was justified, but that the overall campaign was. And taken all together, Thurston argues that there was probably not a general terror among the populace, but if there was, it definitely did not happen any earlier than spring of 1937. I say all that to say that the world was more complex than you tend to see in a lot of depictions of this era. And 37 becomes the emblem of this year when this terror did become a bit more general, right? This is the year that Chukovskaya is going to be writing about in Sofia Petrovna. I mentioned earlier, from 1934 to 1936, you're looking at around 500,000 executions. Excuse me, that'd be a lot. 500,000 arrests, and about 4,000 executions, a little over. 1937 to 1938, that's 1.5, almost 1.6 million arrests, 87 of those being political offenses, with reportedly 681,000 executions. However, Calkins notes that including an unknown number of people who were sentenced to incarceration, the good old 10 years without right of correspondence, who were actually executed, plus others who died during interrogation or transit. He estimates that number at closer to 830,000. I've seen 700,000 other places. Most numbers I see from executions in the terror hover around there. So somewhere in that general ballpark. But when Kotkin is discussing the system in line with revisionists, he's not necessarily just pointing the finger at Stalin, although, of course, he, throughout the book, will say Stalin was the starting point from all this, the one who gets the ball rolling, and the one who continues to push this onward. He also further goes on to look at everyone else as a piece of this puzzle, writing, quote, "The masses became complicit as a result of party cell, factory, and farm meetings, and especially their written denunciations, informing, and extracting confessions. That said, it was neither self-generating nor self-sustaining. Soviet state power was enacted by millions of people, not just those within the formal administrative machinery, but guided by a single individual." So, in other words, Kotkin is kind of arguing that the will of it was from Stalin centrally, pushing this forward, but this would not have happened without any of the machinery that operated around him, which acquiesced, pushed forward, went beyond, etc., etc. Again, that's an argument you don't have to take it. That's where Kotkin takes it. Kotkin also adds this additional element, which lies somewhere between the bureaucratic and the psychological. With as much power as Stalin has, he could organizationally speaking, Politburo members, at least the voting ones, could nominate someone else to be the top secretary of the party, which could be ratified at a plenum of the Central Committee, which was incredibly unlikely. It was probably never going to happen, but Kotkin argues that the psychological possibility that was institutionally possible was something that impacted Stalin in being that he was both certain that they would not do it, but also maintaining an eagerness to nonetheless eliminate that possibility, which is why throughout the purges, you also see some amount of attention being turned onto the highest level of the party, and you see some number of arrests, of even suicides. Like I mentioned earlier, Tomsky, there's also Orjonikidze, who was a well-beloved member of the party who had tried to push back, although he also went along with the purges in various, in turns and in various turns. But throughout the purges, as some of these older Bolsheviks start to step out of the picture by one reason or another, as Kotkin points out, Stalin has a greater grasp on power. Remember at the beginning that most of the leadership in the beginning of 1934 had served under Lenin. They'd seen the world before. By the time you get to the next election of the Central Committee, most of that old guard is arrested, gone, and it's being replaced by a new generation who, as Kotkin argues, is going to be a little bit more pliant, a little bit more reliant on the new world, unlike a lot of the old ones who were gone. And now Stalin no longer has, in this coming era, as many equals, very few equals left, and more so has people who came up below him, not so much people who came up with him, which changes you psychologically. Anyway, that's getting a little bit more into the psychology of it, which I think I said I didn't want to get into, but Stalin Volume 2, it's a good read. It's worthwhile. Of course, always be critical as you read. Read other perspectives as well. Orlando Figuez has writings in this. You can do Sheila Fitzpatrick. There are plenty of people. I will add more stuff in the show notes. But I have been talking for well over an hour, and I have literally not even touched on the book yet. So why don't we go ahead and turn finally to Sofia Petrovna by Lydia Chukovskaya. And I'm worried now that after I've been talking for so long, this is going to be a bit of a letdown because I actually don't have that much to say about it. I think, honestly, a lot of the themes that I'm going to talk about have strangely been covered in the context section. All of the major authors that I cited, not counting the several authors who were in the notebook that I lost, but was actually sitting face open on my desk directly within eyesight this entire time, they all reference Sofia Petrovna by Lydia Chukovskaya, and I think that also informs some of the ways that they approached it. So, just to give you a brief idea of the story, of course, Sofia Petrovna is the main character. She is the mother of a very bright young boy named Kolya, or he's a young man at this point, and her husband has recently died. So in order to provide, she goes out and gets a job at a typist's office where she settles into life. And the first quarter or so of the book is pretty happy for her. She does exceedingly well. She gets promoted into a senior position, oversees the office, and that comes with its own challenges, but she becomes pretty close with one of the more competent typists, Natasha, her son, Kolya, and his best friend, Alec, who grew up together, tinkering with things, eventually get old enough to go to school, and are sent to a factory not far away in order to learn to work there. And he does quite well. He even makes Pravda. For some of the contributions he makes there. However, things start to come tumbling down once Kolya is suddenly arrested, accused of, she doesn't know what he's accused of. She knows he's been arrested. This begins a kind of downward spiral of things in her life. Sofia Petrovna is quite close to the director of the print shop. However, the problem is, there's this man named Gerasimov who had the unfortunate luck of being the nephew of another Gerasimov who was arrested in Moscow. And this dastardly Gerasimov happened to keep working in the print shop after knowing that his uncle had been arrested. So he must be part of some sort of criminal organization. That leads to suspicion on Zakharov, the director, and sometime back when he was traveling abroad, he met this woman and came back to find that she was at some point, heard that she had been searching his room. He reported it almost immediately and came back. Now the suspicion is that she had found something that she was using as blackmail on him. This is something that Sofia Petrovna finds out from a coworker she does not particularly like. As this is happening, Sofia Petrovna is going to the prison to figure out what exactly is going on. She's looking around going, I can't believe I'm sitting here with all these mothers of terrorists or bombers or what have you. Well, no matter. I will get my Kolya out of here. Things continue to fall apart. They do not get better. Natasha makes a spelling error, and that is decided to be an intentional act. Instead of writing Red Army in a document, she accidentally writes Ret Army, and Ret Army is pretty close to Rat Army, which of course must be what she was really trying to convey, so she ends up being fired. Alec and Sofia have a bit of a falling out as Sofia continues to insist that the only thing that has gone wrong is the arrest of her own son, Kolya, while Alec begins to display a greater cynicism towards this whole venture. Eventually, Sofia finds out that her son Kolya has been, what he's been accused of, terrorism, and that he's already confessed, which is followed by Alec being arrested, Natasha soon committing suicide, and Sofia herself somewhat losing her mind as she begins to hallucinate her son coming back before finally getting a letter from her son detailing his actual conditions, which she, at this point, fearing for herself, destroys. It's a fairly short novel. You can finish it really within, I read it within an evening originally. And there's a couple things I want to focus on. First of all, the form. I guess you could call this a socialist realist novel. Not really. I think, if anything, you could call it something more closely related to a realist novel in the 19th century sense of the term. Something that is more in line with a Petersburg text. This is something that Yasha Klotz makes the argument that this is a Petersburg text, right? That's a literary tradition that is sort of articulated first, I think, by the Russian philologist Vladimir Toporov, which encompasses 19th and 20th century texts about St. Petersburg, generally speaking. And most of these are books you'll recognize. They're Gogol's Petersburg Tales, right? Especially The Overcoat, Crime and Punishment, Andre Bailey's Petersburg. And there are a lot of recurring features in these works, but for this novel, I will highlight, first of all, a focus on the individual, usually a so-called ordinary person, and a deployment of fantastical elements amid feelings of helplessness, alienation, etc., etc. Klotz and others compares Petrovna to especially Akaky Akakievich in Gogol's Overcoat, who's, of course, this... Oh boy, The Overcoat. Is that the first thing? No, The Nose was the first thing we ever covered in this podcast. Excuse me. I think The Overcoat came later. Right, Akaky Akakievich is this sort of middling scribe who spends a great deal of his money on this very nice coat before it's stolen by these guards, which leads to him freezing to death and eventually returning as a ghost. You have this resolution in these books, which is typically, right, like this sense of, often in these kinds of texts, you'll find these fantastical elements leading to kind of a break in the character, which is resolved in sometimes assimilation. In the case of Crime and Punishment, it ends with, of course, Raskolnikov accepting religion, accepting Sasha? Oh my gosh, I've forgotten her name. But anyway, which is sort of an edge case there. The religion isn't the dominating element of the society, if you want to. I mean, I think part of it is Dostoevsky not seeing those religious elements in many places except a few characters in the novel who then, of course, in the case of, God, I cannot remember her name. That's unfortunate. Not Sasha. I want to keep wanting to say Sasha, but let's say Sasha for now. Sasha passing on the religion to Raskolnikov, or on the other hand, going back to The Overcoat, it's resolved in sort of a madness and then death. In this case, we have a slight subversion of that. You have a descent into madness, but it ends on a sudden moment of clarity, and a sudden moment of clarity which is society looking Sofia Petrovna in the eyes. All these things she suspects have come true. She gets a letter from her son telling her exactly what's going on, that he's been tortured, that he needs her help, and she destroys that letter. So at the very end, you've got this very Petersburg-like text tendency to this look into madness, and then in this case, Sofia Petrovna blinks. And I think that reflects a more general blinking of the public. I'll come back to that in a second. That's a point in its own right, but I just wanted to point out some of these parallels that this is drawing on. Obviously, Lydia Chukovskaya did not initially intend this for publication, or if she did, not for quite a while. So it's not really following a lot of the literary trends of the actual published market at the time. Throughout the novel, you see some of the ridiculousness of this era, right? At the very beginning of the purges, the terror section, let's say, when Gerasimov is accused of being a terrorist in some way, the only person who speaks up and asks is Natasha. And this exchange happens, quote, "And what did they do in the print shop?" Natasha said timidly. The director nodded at the chairman of the mescom. "What did they do?" she repeated in a shrill voice, rising from her chair. "I think, Comrade Frolenko, I just explained in plain Russian that ex-supervisor of our print shop, Gerasimov, turned out to be the nephew of the Moscow Gerasimov. He maintained daily family contact with his uncle, undermined the Stakhanovite movement in the print shop." And Stakhanovite movement is sort of this term for exceeding the quotas. All these workers going heroically beyond physical limitations to deliver more than is asked for. Kind of a oh God, what's his name? That guy who hammered in a bunch of rail spikes. John Henry was a steel-driving man. John Henry, yeah, okay. I don't know why I did that in Moldy Peaches cadence. I don't know if you could tell it's 2 a.m. Don Quixote was a steel All right, I gotta get back on track if I remember to get this done out tomorrow. But anyway, Sakhanovite movement in the print shop wrecked the plan on the orders of his relative, with the criminal connivance of our party organization. So you see, on one hand, something we have known about this, which is something we covered quite extensively, which is the tenuous ways that people were arrested. In this case, merely because he is the relative of someone who was arrested who we talked to. A very strange thing to do to your relative, right? And that becomes his crime. And these things move so readily. And more importantly, how readily other people accept it. Natasha is the only person who thinks to question it. Even Sofia Petrovna doesn't. She basically accepts it almost immediately. Whereas Natasha and Alec are the two characters who sort of are on the outside of all of this. Sofia Petrovna keeps moving along. She's, as noted by other people, she's a fairly surface level person, fairly vain. Early in the novel, she comments on people are wearing, the quality of makeup, etc., etc. And that is her inability to see beyond skin deep is something that I think makes Sofia Petrovna kind of representative of many people at this time. She accepts Gerasimov being arrested. She insists that Kolya, her own son, must be innocent, of course, but these other ones are probably guilty, right? When the director, Zakharov, is arrested and she hears the story that he was being blackmailed, she accepts it very readily. Again, quote, and in fact, Sofia Petrovna hadn't the slightest idea as to what Comrade Zakharov did when he wasn't presiding at publishing house meetings or leading his little girl up to the New Year's tree. All men, every last one of them, were terribly fond of pretty women. Any cheeky housemaid could wrap any man, even a decent one, around her little finger. If Sofia Petrovna had not thrown Fanny out in time, there's no telling how her flirtation with Fyodor Ivanovich might have ended. In this case, Fyodor Ivanovich is her now deceased husband. So she accepts very readily Zakharov's arrest, right? She's in line with other women trying to get information about her own son, and she looks around and thinks, I can't imagine how awful it must be for a mother to learn that her son is a saboteur. So going back to Thurston's analysis that there were plenty of people who generally accepted what was going on, that these were probably correct arrests, but when it came to their family, that was the exception, right? This is kind of the role that Sofia Petrovna is acting here. She's filling in sort of the voice of a generation. She's representative of a general type of person that existed in this period. And I keep going back to Sofia Petrovna. Obviously, it's her story, so she's a big part of it, but I want to go back to some other characters before I completely lose track of that. Obviously, there is Kolya, who is, after the beginning of the story, not so much of a character, except for the very end, which I will talk about before we finish, but let's get to that later. There is Alec, who is, I think, sort of representative of someone who begins to understand, representative of someone who is understanding there is a greater injustice happening. And you don't quite get that. There are hints of it happening, that he is looking around and he sees these things. For example, whereas Sofia Petrovna is continually insistent that Kolya is the innocent one, Alec goes beyond that. Quote, then this is after Sofia Petrovna and Alec have a bit of a tiff. Quote, then for some reason Alec came back. He went up to Natasha, who was sitting beside the window knitting. What do you think, Natalia Sergeyevna? He asked, his eyes looking her straight in the face from behind his glasses. They're in prison. Are they all as guilty as Kolya? All those mothers standing in line somehow look an awful lot like Sofia Petrovna. I don't know, answered Natasha, in a way that was now typical of her. At this point in the story, Natasha, of course, has been fired, but something I think I failed to mention is that you find out through the course of the book that Natasha sort of had a romantic connection with Kolya, something that they'd kept under wraps from Sofia Petrovna, who considers Natasha not quite good enough of a match for her son, not quite attractive enough. She attractive in the sense that she looks at Natasha as kind of half dead, very gray. She kind of sees someone very vivacious and full of life for her son, not this Natasha, but it's never really commented on. So you have Alec, this person who is seeing some injustice and beginning to hint at that and asking the people around him. This is after he's already been they've heard that he's confessed, so he must be guilty. And so he says, are they all really that guilty? It's no surprise that Alec, not long after this, when he tries to return to the factory where they came from, is also arrested. Going to Natasha for a moment, I think she's representative of another type, a type of person which we've not talked about, but perhaps someone who has checked out. After she gets fired, she becomes mostly a non-entity. Very early on, she's very involved, wants to know exactly what's going on with Kolya, even quite audaciously asks for a picture of him, which Sofia Petrovna doesn't pick up on. She just thinks, oh, yes, of course. Why wouldn't you love a picture of my son? I love these pictures of my son. And, of course, we understand that there's that deeper element going on there. But Natasha checks out. She doesn't fight in the same way that Alec tends to fight with others. Sofia Petrovna has a drive to keep going and keep finding out what happened to Kolya, to bring him food, all these things, and try to restore him to society. Natasha doesn't quite have that. She helps out, but she retreats more and more, and it ends with Natasha killing herself. Slightly before she does, she comes over and she's kind of in this she's very happy. She's suddenly like, oh, it's going to work out. Not exactly saying it's all work out, but the day before that Natasha kills herself, she comes to Sofia Petrovna in a sudden happiness that's been totally absent in her character for most of the novel. This is shortly after Alec's arrest, and she encourages Sofia Petrovna to go find Kolya. She feels that he's so close, and she is kind of cleaning and talking to her and suddenly full of life in a way that she has not been for most of this novel. And then she comes to this moment where she says, what do you think? How do you explain the fact Kolya confessed? You can trip a person up, confuse him. I understand that, but only in small things. How could Kolya have been brought to the point of confessing to a crime he never committed? No matter what you say, I simply can't understand that. And why did they all confess? All the wives are told their husbands confessed. Were they all tripped up? He simply wasn't able to establish his alibi, said Sofia Petrovna. Don't forget, Natasha, he's still very young. And why was Alec arrested? Oh, Natasha, if you only knew the kind of crude language he used in front of everyone in line, I'm sure now that his tongue was the undoing of Kolya, too. Natasha got ready to leave. As she said goodbye, she suddenly embraced Sofia Petrovna. What's the matter with you today? Asked Sofia Petrovna. With me? Nothing. Sit still, don't get up, it's not necessary. How much you look like Kolya, Kolya looks like you. And then she goes on to give her some other things that she should do, and Sofia Petrovna, someone who does not read people very well, does not recognize frankly, well, I think now, in an era when perhaps psychology content is blasted directly into her eyes from every time you ever open up any social media app, that sudden burst of excitement from someone who has been very depressed, pretty typical sign of a decision being made with regards to suicidal ideation. But you have a similar line here. Natasha, similar to Alec, is starting to question. Alec seems a little sharper. He's kind of, in his questions they're a little bit less, they're a little more pointed. When Alec asks, are all those mothers standing in line somehow, who all look a lot like Sofia Petrovna, it's sort of an accusation. Whereas we see in Natasha, I think, someone who is not fully able to come to terms with the enormity of what is happening, right? All the wives are told their husbands confessed. Were they all tripped up? She is trying, I think, to make sense of this, right? How could they all have confessed? What is going on in all this? And I don't think she's able to come to an answer. Or maybe she has one that she is, perhaps, maybe the implication is that she's trying to lead Sofia Petrovna to an end. But frankly, reading the text from where I am now, I don't necessarily think I see that. I think I see someone who has questions that she knows there are not good answers to, and probably the very fact of those questions seem to be so shaking that her faith in this world is broken. Kolya is gone. Alec is gone. How could all these things have happened? And so she checks out. I think this is representative of another type of person, maybe not necessarily ones who did commit suicide, although that's certainly possible, but people who just did not engage in normal life anymore and didn't even try to. That seems to be a character type, possibly, that there is. Finally, there is well, there's more characters, but the last one I really want to talk about before we go back to Sofia Petrovna is Mrs. Kiparasova, who is the wife of Ivan Kiparasov. Ivan Kiparasov was Kolya's godfather, who has been, towards the beginning of the novel, he's been arrested. And when Sofia Petrovna finds out, there's this line, quote, "After Kirov's murder, there had been many arrests, but at the time, they first took all kinds of oppositionists, then old regime people, all kinds of Vons and barons, but now it was doctors." And again, talking about Thurston, this idea of the terror not as something that was an all, overbearing umbrella over everyone, but something that went category by category: engineers, doctors, etc., etc. And this is something that, despite the fact that Sofia Petrovna, when she finds out, she kind of says, "Oh, of course, that must be a mistake for them too. I'm sure, surely Ivan could not have been doing whatever they've accused him of." But over the course of the novel, she engages in that less and less, and you can tell that Kiparasova is completely jaded with this system, and she continues to give Sofia Petrovna advice that she's not really taking. Kiparasova seems to understand on some level that they are not coming back, and they should not keep trying to put their neck out, because then they will be the ones who are on the chopping block next. And she's the one whose influence, I think, at the beginning of the novel, when Chukovskaya, when Sofia Petrovna falls under the illusion that her son is coming home, and she begins to tell everyone, "Oh, actually, it was all a mistake. This is what's happening now. He'll be home soon. Oh, let me tell you all these funny stories," which she's making up. At this point, she's losing her mind to the degree that she's stocking up all these foods she wants to give him. She won't even eat herself. She's borderline starving to death, despite being in this mountain of food, because she's in such a delusion about what's happening. But Kiparasova is the one who essentially gives her this advice that, forget everything you've seen. Stop engaging with this. You're only putting yourself in danger. And at the very end of the novel, Sofia Petrovna finally has this moment of clarity when she gets this letter from Alec, which is the first time she's been able to talk to him since almost the beginning, since he leaves for the factory. And she sees that he is being tortured, and she sees that he needs help. And in this moment of clarity, Kiparasova's advice in the background, she destroys the letter. Her society looks her in the eye. This character who spent this entire novel kind of skin deep, accepting everything for what it is, realizing truly that something has gone wrong here, and she looks away. She pretends she didn't see it. This is a betrayal of her son, this very beloved son, this family member. Other people, Alec, she was willing to kind of throw under the bus. Of course, he was probably the one who got Kolya into trouble. Natasha, she simply can't understand, but her son, that's what's driven her. And she kindly comes to the moment where she can do something. Not something that would have any effect, probably. I think it seems to be the case that she maybe rightly understands that she would, as Kiparasova advises her, only be putting herself in danger by doing so. And in that moment, her sense of self-preservation, I think, takes over. And she puts that letter away, and she closes the chapter on her son. This book is a searing condemnation of an era. This question I often ask Grossman, looking back at his own time and asking what is the defense of his era. Of course, the defense for Grossman is that only that in a few years later, right? Of course, World War II, the Holocaust, the camps is what he's looking at. But the defense of their era is only that they did not allow what is human in man to die. But of course, that wasn't a universal thing. It was not, when Grossman says we did not allow what is human in man to die, he does not mean everyone maintained that. He means there were some people who maintained that. And as long as some people maintain that, then the possibility remains for anyone to achieve that. Here we have an example of someone who lets, maybe this sounds kind of strong, someone who lets what is human in them die as a self-preservation strategy. Someone who's representative of a great many people at a time. How could you live under this, right? And if you read Anna Akhmatova's Requiem, you get one perspective. The oppression of every day, pushing forward, of the fears and anxieties and standing in these lines. Here, you have someone who looks away from it and pretends it's not happening. Another form of survival. Something that certainly many people did do. And this realization only comes with respect to her own family. Everyone else is rightfully on the chopping block. Earlier in the novel, we have this line, quote, well, whole paragraph actually. They discussed how indignant Kolya must be right now. And not only Kolya, all decent people were indignant. Why, the trains derailed by the saboteurs might contain children. What heartlessness, monsters. It was not for nothing the Trotskyites were hand in glove with the Gestapo. They really were no better than the fascists who were murdering children in Spain. And was it really possible that Dr. Kiparasov had been part of the bandit gang? He had often been invited to a consultation along with Fyodor Ivanovich. After the consultation, Fyodor Ivanovich would bring him home to have a cup of tea and to visit for a while. Sofia Petrovna had seen him close up, just as she could see Natasha now. Now he had joined a gang of bandits. Who would have thought? Such a worthy old man. So despite what Sofia Petrovna, this is maybe a point I should have made earlier, saying to Kiparasova, oh, of course your husband can't be guilty. Privately, she thinks he probably is. There's this deep betrayal of humanity going on here, not only of her own son, of all the people around her, this generalized condemnation of what had happened. And yet, I'm speaking in strong terms here, but I don't think that this is a character to villainize. This is a tragedy. When I say that she is betraying, she is blinking, I'm not putting her in the stockade and throwing tomatoes at her. I'm looking at what a great many people would have done in that same situation. Not as a villain, but as a tragic, destroyed figure, like so many people who lived through it. That's what I see when I read this book. And this episode has gone on way too long already. So I think I'll close it out here and tell you to pick it up. It's truly a quick read. I'm really excited to get to Going Under, which tackles the same subject from about a decade forward, and I've read is a little bit less relentlessly negative, although you might understand, given that this was written, during the terror versus 10 years later, your outlook is going to change a little bit when you're no longer in the thick of it. But anyhow, before I let you go, I just wanted to let you know what we're covering next time. We are going to be going back to Kazakhstan to talk about a poetry collection that was originally published just after the turn of the 20th century, called Mosquito, written by Akhmet Baytursinov and translated by Jake Zavlaski. I assume it's Zavlaski, Zawlacki. I will be joined by Jake to talk about the collection, Baytursinov himself, some of the very wonderfully funny pieces that are found in here. I had a lot of fun reading it, same way that Sofia Petrovna is a quick read, so is this. Both really enjoyable. I'm actually about to do that interview 2 days from now, and I'm really looking forward to it. So I hope you enjoy it as much as I have already enjoyed reading the book. But if you want to support the podcast, you can head on over to SlavicLitPod.com. And I'd like to extend a sincere thank you to everybody who already supports the podcast. You help me keep the lights on, pay for the website, buy the books, and spend well over a month doing very stupid things like this on topics that I don't think necessarily needed this much research. But all the same, you help me do it, and I appreciate that. Thank you. The music used in this episode, as always, was Starое Kino by Peremotka. You can find spellings and a link to their Bandcamp in the show notes. You'll hear from me again soon.